The school hallway is brightly lit, the hum of distant voices echoing through the walls. In the middle of this seemingly ordinary day, Jada, a small black girl, runs out of the bathroom, her face streaked with tears and panic. Her tiny hands grip her chest as she gasps for breath, fear evident in every step. Her feet echo loudly in the quiet hallway as she makes a beeline for the janitor, Mr. Simmons, who is mopping the floor. His back is turned, and he doesn't see her approaching. Jada's small feet echoed in the silent hallway as she sprinted toward Mr. Simmons, her tears blurring her vision. They're in there, she whispered with fear in her voice. 4 simple words, and Mr. Simmons' face drained of color. He froze, his mop slipping from his hand as the room fell into heavy silence. The hook immediately pulls the audience in with suspense and emotion. The simple, chilling words spoken by Jada leave the audience in anticipation, eager to know who or what she's referring to, setting the stage for a deeper mystery to unfold. Jada stood in front of Mr. Simmons, her small body trembling violently. Her hands gripped his sleeve like a lifeline, her sobs coming in jagged breaths. Tears streaked down her cheeks, and her eyes, wide with fear, stared up at him. They're in there, she whispered again, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own sobbing. Mr. Simmons froze for a moment, his hand still gripping the mop, but his usual calm demeanor vanished as he looked at her. The janitor's heart pounded in his chest as the words echoed in his mind. They're in there. His instincts told him to remain calm, but the gnawing sense of dread growing in the pit of his stomach told him that something was terribly wrong. He had seen his fair share of distress, from broken windows to lost pets, but this felt different. This felt like danger. He knelt down to Jada, his face softening as he gently placed his hand on her shoulder. Jada, listen to me, he said softly, his voice trying to steady the growing panic in both their hearts. Who's in there? What happened? Jada's eyes met his with a mix of terror and confusion. She couldn't find the words. All she could do was stare, frozen with fear, as if the weight of the situation had shackled her voice. Mr. Simmons's thoughts raced. He knew something was wrong, but his experience had taught him to stay calm and assess. His hands shook slightly as he helped Jada up from the floor and wiped her tears away, but there was something in his gut urging him to act quickly. The last thing he wanted was for something to happen under his watch. The camera shifted and we were transported into a past that Mr. Simmons had long buried. The scene unfolded in an old rundown school building. The halls were dimly lit and the air carried an eerie heaviness. Young Mr. Simmons, barely out of his 20s, was walking briskly through the hallway, looking at a stack of papers in his hand. He was the new janitor at the school, trying to make a fresh start. He was wiping down a classroom when it happened, the sounds of a struggle followed by a loud crash. He rushed to the sound, his pulse quickening with each step. What he found would haunt him for years. There, in a secluded classroom, he found a young child, no older than Jada, crying and bruised. The teacher, a man who had held a position of authority, was nowhere to be found, but the child's injuries spoke volumes. Mr. Simmons, a bystander in that moment, felt his stomach twist in disgust, his heart sinking into his chest. In the weeks that followed, he learned the truth. The child had been hurt by the teacher, and although Mr. Simmons didn't personally witness the crime, the weight of his failure to act haunted him. The system had failed that child, and the guilt Mr. Simmons carried was suffocating. The flashback ended, leaving Mr. Simmons standing in the present, visibly shaken. The trauma of that moment, the fear, the regret, flooded his mind, and he realized the connection. It had never truly left him. And now, with Jada's words, it all felt as though it were happening again. He could not let another child suffer like that. He had to protect her, no matter the cost. The moment the flashback ended, Mr. Simmons' sense of urgency returned. He stood up, his hand instinctively pulling Jada to her feet as he spoke with quiet authority. "We need to go now." Jada, still clutching his hand, nodded eagerly, her small fingers gripping his as if her life depended on it. Together, they started walking quickly toward the bathroom. The hallway felt unnaturally long, the sounds of chattering students and distant classroom activities growing faint in the background. Every step seemed to echo with a foreboding rhythm, amplifying the tension that hung in the air. The normal hum of the school had faded. No longer was it just another school day. It had become something far more serious, something David had no control over, and everything seemed to hinge on what was waiting in that bathroom. As they approached the restroom, Mr. Simmons's pulse quickened. His body tensed as he listened. It was a slight noise at first, almost imperceptible, a soft scraping sound that only added to his mounting anxiety. He could feel Jada's grip tightening as they neared the door, and the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. Jada's breath was shallow. She looked up at him, her face pale, and without a word she squeezed his hand tighter. He pushed the door open cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. His eyes scanned the room quickly. Inside, there was nothing out of the ordinary at first glance, but as he stepped further into the bathroom, he heard it. Another soft noise coming from one of the stalls. A faint shuffling sound followed by a low, strained voice. Mr. Simmons felt his heart drop. He glanced down at Jada, whose eyes were wide with dread. The tension in the air felt suffocating. He turned back toward the bathroom, eyes darting to every corner, every shadow. He moved closer to the source of the sound, his instincts screaming at him to act quickly. With one last breath, he pulled open the stall door, fully prepared to confront whatever waited inside, and then his world froze. The door to the bathroom creaked as Mr. Simmons slowly pushed it open, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind raced with the possibilities of what he might find. Jada's grip on his hand tightened, her fear palpable. The air in the bathroom felt thick, charged with tension. As the door opened fully, the scene inside made Mr. Simmons's blood run cold. A group of older kids, boys and girls, perhaps 14 or 15, stood over a smaller child, a younger boy who looked no older than 8. The bullies had cornered him, shoving him against the sink. The poor child's face was streaked with tears, his clothes torn and dirty, his hands held up in a weak defense as the older kids laughed. The bullying stopped immediately when they saw Mr. Simmons. The loud, mocking voices fell silent as all the eyes in the room turned toward him. The boys and girls stood frozen, unsure whether to retreat or challenge the authority of the janitor. Jada stood close to Mr. Simmons, her face filled with a mix of fear and relief. She looked up at him, her wide eyes pleading for him to act. It was as if she knew without words that he was the only one who could stop the torment. The weight of the situation settled heavily on his shoulders. Mr. Simmons's first instinct was to intervene, to stop the bullying. He knew what he had to do, but something inside him hesitated. The memory of his past, of failing to act in time and the consequences that followed, flashed through his mind like a series of painful snapshots. His heart beat faster, his hands trembling as he faced the group of older kids. The boy in the corner, the one being bullied, shrank into himself, still cowering in fear. The older kids exchanged looks, sizing Mr. Simmons up. One of the boys sneered, his arms crossed defiantly. "What do you want, old man?" he taunted, not quite a question, but a challenge. Mr. Simmons stood still, his feet rooted to the floor, his eyes darting between the bullies and the helpless boy. His voice faltered, but he finally spoke, trying to sound firm, though the unease in his voice was impossible to ignore. "Leave him alone," Mr. Simmons ordered, his voice shaking just slightly. "You're not allowed to treat anyone like this. I'm calling for help, and I suggest you leave now." The bullies chuckled darkly, exchanging glances, clearly sensing his hesitation. The room seemed to close in on Mr. Simmons as he wrestled with his fear. His hands, which had once held the tools to clean up messes and maintain order, now felt useless. His past experience, the traumatic event involving the other child, clouded his mind. He had failed then. He couldn't fail now. But the weight of his past was heavy, and he feared that standing up might cost him more than he could handle. Jada's voice cut through the tension. Please, Mr. Simmons, she whispered, her small voice filled with desperation. You have to stop them. His heart surged with a sudden clarity. Joda's plea, her innocence, cut through his fear. He couldn't let this happen again. He had to be the man he wished he had been in the past. He couldn't let these kids feel like no one was there to protect them. He took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders, and took a step forward. For a moment, everything froze. Both Mr. Simmons and the bullies locked in a tense standoff. The kids were used to getting away with whatever they wanted, and the janitor was just another adult to challenge or ignore. But something had shifted in Mr. Simmons. His internal conflict, his fear, his doubt, his guilt, was beginning to fade, replaced by the clarity that he had to act. He could feel the weight of the moment in his bones. The small, terrified boy in the corner, Jada's wide eyes staring up at him, the years of regret flooding his mind. His knees wobbled, but he didn't allow himself to falter. Mr. Simmons opened his mouth to speak, but his words came out unsure. "This is wrong," he said, his voice much quieter than he intended. He cleared his throat and spoke again, more forcefully this time. "I'm calling the staff. I'm getting you suspended if you don't leave now." The kids didn't move. One of the older girls sneered. "What are you going to do, old man? You really think we're scared of you?" The boy who had spoken earlier started walking toward Mr. Simmons, his expression cocky, almost daring the janitor to make a move. The tension in the air became suffocating. Mr. Simmons's hands shook, the trauma of his past creeping in like an overwhelming flood. And yet, as the boy came closer, something inside Mr. Simmons shifted. He straightened his back, looked the bully directly in the eyes, and found his voice once again. "I'm not afraid of you," he said, his voice stronger now. "You don't get to terrorize kids in this school, not anymore." The bullies paused. Their confidence wavered, as if they were realizing for the first time that this man wasn't backing down. There was something different about him now. He wasn't just the janitor anymore. He was someone who was willing to fight for what was right. The older kids exchanged unsure glances, the defiance in their eyes slowly fading as they assessed the situation. Finally, the boy who had confronted Mr. Simmons turned, gesturing for the others to follow him. They slinked away reluctantly, muttering curses under their breath. As they disappeared, Mr. Simmons let out a long breath, his body sagging with the release of tension. He turned toward the little boy who was still huddled in the corner, shaking with fear. "Are you okay?" Mr. Simmons asked, his voice softer now. The boy looked up at him, his eyes wide with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Jada stood next to Mr. Simmons, her small hand still holding onto his. She looked up at him, her face softening. "You did it," she said quietly, her voice full of relief. For the first time in years, Mr. Simmons felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had done the right thing. He had faced his past, and in doing so, he had protected this child from a fate similar to the one he had failed to stop all those years ago. But the battle wasn't over. The system was broken, and he knew it. But for now, at least in this moment, he had made a difference. Mr. Simmons took one last deep breath and turned to face the bathroom door. The noise had stopped, and the hallway now seemed quieter than ever before. The echoes of the past still clung to him, but they didn't hold the same power over him anymore. This time he had taken control. This time he had made sure someone was safe. The young boy, still standing with Jada, looked up at Mr. Simmons with gratitude, his eyes filled with silent thanks. Tamara's quiet strength had been the catalyst, but Mr. Simmons had overcome his own demons. He had protected the innocent. As they walked back down the hallway, heading toward the office to call for assistance, Mr. Simmons couldn't help but feel that for the first time he had taken a step toward making things right, not just for the boy in the bathroom, but for the countless others who had been silenced. The echoes of a child's bravery had changed everything. The tension in the school's office was palpable as the teachers and principal gathered to discuss the events of the day. Mr. Simmons sat in one of the small chairs in the principal's office, his back straight and his hands folded on his lap. Despite the praise he had received, a gnawing sense of uncertainty tugged at him. The principal, Mrs. Anderson, stood before him, a professional smile on her face. "Mr. Simmons, what you did today was courageous," she said, her voice sincere. "You handled the situation with grace and speed. We're lucky to have you here." Mr. Simmons nodded but felt no relief. "I don't know if I did enough," he said quietly, his voice betraying the uncertainty inside. "I didn't want to make things worse. I didn't want to fail her, like I failed others in the past." Mrs. Anderson sat down across from him, her eyes filled with understanding. "You did what needed to be done. You protected that child, and you stopped something terrible from happening." Jada, now calm and no longer crying, stood quietly beside Mr. Simmons. She looked up at him with gratitude, though she didn't speak. The weight of the day's events had shifted, but the emotional residue lingered. The principal placed a reassuring hand on Mr. Simmons's shoulder. "The parents are aware of what happened, and the situation will be addressed. There will be consequences for the students involved, and will ensure that this kind of behavior is dealt with. You don't need to carry this alone." Despite Mrs. Anderson's reassurance, Mr. Simmons couldn't shake the doubts that lingered in his mind. Would this experience really lead to lasting change? Would the school's actions be enough to prevent future incidents? He didn't have the answers, but he knew that the journey had just begun, for him and for the children he was entrusted to protect. Later that day, as the school day began to wind down, Mr. Simmons found himself walking Jada to the door of the classroom. The situation had calmed, but the heaviness of the event still hung in the air. Jada stood at the door, looking up at Mr. Simmons, her face softening as she met his gaze. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice small but full of meaning. Mr. Simmons kneeled down to her level, offering a warm smile. "You don't need to thank me, Jada. You were brave, and you helped make sure the right thing happened." Jada hesitated, her eyes still filled with the remnants of fear, but she nodded. I was scared," she admitted, "but you made me feel safe." Her words cut through the tension in Mr. Simmons's chest. He had done what he thought was right, but hearing Jada's gratitude helped him understand the true impact of his actions. It wasn't about making grand gestures. It was about providing a safe space, about being present when someone needed protection, and about standing up for what was right, even when it was hard. Mr. Simmons placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "You're going to be okay, Jada. You're a strong girl." Jada's face softened, and a small relieved smile appeared on her lips. For a brief moment, the shadows of fear faded, replaced by a sense of peace. As they both stood in the quiet hallway, the weight of the day's events slowly lifted. Jada's trembling hands no longer gripped his arm in fear, and Mr. Simmons felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. He had faced his past fears, stepped into the unknown, and had protected the innocent. The camera pans over Mr. Simmons standing by the window, watching as Jada plays with her classmates outside. The golden light of the afternoon casts a peaceful glow on the playground, a stark contrast to the intense moments of the day. Mr. Simmons's expression is soft, filled with a quiet pride as he reflects on how far he's come. In a world where silence often prevails, sometimes it's the quiet ones who make the biggest difference. But for Mr. Simmons, the fight for justice is far from over, and this victory is just the beginning.